So the first part of this talk will start with the anonymous 1607 play, The Fair Maid of the Exchange, which you don't have to know to understand what I'll be talking about. And I'll be tracking some big picture frameworks in early modern disability studies. So my work on theatricality, disability, and performance is rooted in my identity as a scholar of 16th and 17th century English drama. My questions about disability representation emerge from Shakespeare's historical moment and from early modern literary studies. And I also think with and through performance in the present. The second and third parts of this talk elaborate on two case studies in my recent book, looking first at King Lear and then at Richard III to locate a Shakespearean recognition of disability. Recent critical conversations in early modern disability studies focus on King Lear's networks of disability. I read these debates about the play as evidence for a critical practice animated by vectors of recognition and misrecognition. The final section considers how we recognize disability performance, that is, performance by disabled actors in the present. The role of Richard in Shakespeare's Richard III is one dominant framework through which disabled actors are understood, and one with a robust tradition of disability imitation by able-bodied actors. Thus, a content warning about this latter section, while the focus is performances by disabled artists, it will also include references to and images of able-bodied performances of disability, what we often call cripping up, to follow Petra Kupper's, or in Sam Yates's term, disability simulation. And I begin by introducing a character from early modern drama in Fair Maid of the Exchange, who is known only as Cripple, a name that appears on a few slides showing the early printed text. When I've taught this play, my students have proposed referring to him as C to elevate his humanity over the slur that is his designation in the play. And I will follow that practice as I speak in this talk. And finally, a quick note about visual descriptions. My PowerPoint offers critical quotations, snippets of early printed texts, and images from productions. I've embedded the content in my text, but if an image proves useful for discussion after the talk, I invite a collective practice of image description as we read visual details together. Recognizing Shakespearean disability from the Fair Maid of the Exchange to Richard III. When I first studied the anonymous 1607 play, Fair Maid of the Exchange, I wasn't looking for disability. I was interested in how early modern playwrights thought about theater, in particular about the relationship between written text and embodied performance. Then, disability emerged as the very form of that thinking. And the play's central figure, whom I'll call C, became one of the key figures of disability in my first book. Early modern theater and the figure of disability takes up plays by Shakespeare and beyond, including Marlowe's Dr. Faustus and the unattributed play Alarm for London, to show how the figure of disability is central to early modern drama's understanding of the relationship between actor and character. This non-Shakespearean play, The Fair Maid of the Exchange, is a city comedy set in a recognizable early 17th century London. Because the play takes place in the business center of London's Royal Exchange, which anchors the intertwined marketplaces of goods, texts, and marriages, until 2013, the play's few critics studied those dynamics of commerce and desire, typical of the city comedy genre. Over the past 12 years, those of us interested in early modern disability representations have turned to the play's unusual central character, C, who runs a shop in the Exchange and moves with crutches due to an unnamed limb difference. At the beginning of the play, the fair maid, Phyllis Flower, falls in love with C. C excludes himself from the marriage market, even as he flourishes in the world of circulating goods and texts. Not seeking marriage himself, C matchmakes by helping his friend Frank, who loves Phyllis. He facilitates Frank's pursuit of Phyllis by offering the disguise of his own crutches and crooked habit. C says to Frank, "I will immediately you take my crooked habit, and in that disguise court her. Yea, win her. Assume this shape of mine." To win Phyllis, Frank appropriates C's crutches, clothing, and perhaps physical comportment, habit, in a disability impersonation, a disability play within the play. This is what I mean by figure of disability, the connection between disability and imitation, disability and figuration suggested by Frank's disability costume. I track the presence of an early modern disability aesthetic in the period, grounded in this link between disability and theatricality. The aesthetic and analytical power of the figure of disability in Fair Maid of the Exchange is immediately suggested when, long before Frank appropriates C's habit, the figure appears in the play's prologue. The prologue apologizes for the play. Though our invention lame, imperfect be, yet give the C alms for charity. The play's flaws are identified with the disabled body of its central figure. Here, disability becomes a metaphor for artistic imperfection, but also for invention, for the creative process that uses supports and prostheses. As the play unfolds, the prologue's metaphor, the play is disabled, is reinscribed and reworked in material embodied terms as we get to know C as somebody who doesn't need charity, someone who in fact gives of his identity as costume to Frank. The result is a layered echo. Disability first as rhetoric, then as C's embodiment, then as Frank's imitation of that embodiment. Far from needing alms, the figure of C functions as a kind of aesthetic bank, disability paying dividends in echoing representations. Figure of disability contributes to broader conversations about disability's aesthetic power in early modern literary studies. Catherine Williams's Unfixable Forms argues that early modern drama insists that we recognize the power of fictions to explode the categories that an ableist culture imposes and to contribute to the political efforts of thinking disability otherwise in the present. Resistant gestures that guide the way we attend to disability in its aesthetic dimensions as a powerful resource for the expressive capacity that disability offers to textual representation. Elizabeth Bearden's Crip Authority distinguishes how early modern disabled authors reappropriate the genre and art of consolation literature to write disability narrative with Crip authority. In the ways that Williams and Bearden recognize disability, we can distinguish connections between disability aesthetics, a focus on disability's representational undertakings, and the ethical and political commitments of disability studies to honor and foster the thriving of all human variation across diverse body minds. In what follows, I'll share two case studies drawn from sections of my new book, Shakespeare and Disability Theory, which has two goals: to take stock of the field of early modern disability studies and its engagement with Shakespeare, and to argue for the critical purchase of attending to disability in motion, what I call recognizing disability. Where the earlier book centers on the self-contained figure of disability, this new book follows disability's movement, the ways disability circulates in plays, refracts among bodies, intersects with other aspects of identity, moves through theatrical time. Shakespearean disability is not a distinguishable set of singular bounded characters with identifiable disabilities, but unpredictably emerges across mutable forms. Recognizing disability, a methodological keystone of the book, means attending to disability in motion. There it is. It's moving. So Shakespeare Disability Studies combines the recognition of disability in dramatic theatrical texts with the recognition of disability in a historically distant period. In elevating recognition, I'm working with what Tobin Siebers names as disability knowledge. Siebers asserts disability as a valuable body of knowledge about the ways that environment and embodiment mutually transform one another. While the medical model of disability elevates medical and legal authority over disabled experience, disability knowledge displaces this structure. The identification of people with disabilities no longer derives solely from the physical or mental properties of their bodies. People are not recognized as disabled apart from their self-knowledge. Disability knowledge is a way of knowing we can both recognize in literary texts and bring to texts as an interpretive mode. As Siebers further suggests, the disabled know themselves and others, including others in literary texts, as disabled based on the possession and use of disability-embodied knowledge. Embodied disability knowledge recognizes, in the sense of regards, the agential transformative power of disabled body minds. In literary disability studies, then, we might recognize disability in at least three ways: by acknowledging the presence of disability in texts, by regarding the valuable knowledge comprehended in those disability representations, and by identifying disability representations as one's own through the perception of a shared disability knowledge. As Shakespeare and Disability Theory takes stock of the current state of the field of Shakespeare disability studies, its methods and its archives, I essay what we are recognizing as disability in Shakespeare's plays, and out of this essay, I make a claim that we should recognize disability not simply in static singular characters, but rather among characters in plays, in networks, in intersections, in intertexts, in performance histories. Drawing on the energy of the cultural model of disability, which refuses the identification of disability with the individual body-mind in favor of apprehending disability as distributed, I ask what this distributed recognition can look like in reading across, between, and among plays. That Shakespearean disability may powerfully exist as a pattern among multiple characters in a play, that to recognize disability is to recognize it as iterative, as everywhere, is reflected in recent critical work on Shakespeare's King Lear. I turn now to this play to plot some of the modes in which Shakespeare scholarship has recognized disability in that play. Scholars repeatedly find Lear's world of disability boundless, both in disability's instability as a category, what are the boundaries of madness, and in expanding networks of disabled characters, especially affiliations among Lear, Poor Tom, and the Fool. I'm interested in how Shakespeare disability studies organizes itself around and through this play because the pattern of these arguments helps us see the stakes of disability investments in the play, how critical recognitions and disavowals refract the play's own disability designs. Recalling the tripartite idea of recognition from a moment ago, acknowledging the presence of disability in texts, regarding the valuable knowledge comprehended in those representations, and identifying disability representations as one's own through the perception of a shared disability knowledge. I'll begin by zeroing in on a key scene, and then I'll situate recent critical examples of reading disability in Lear in relation to this paradigm of recognition. At the center of King Lear, representations of madness, intellectual disability, and socioeconomic physical precarity collide in the compelling scenes in the storm on the heath. The contentious storm in which vulnerable, unbonneted bodies suffer similar rages to those in Lear's Tempest of the Mind brings together Lear's going mad, the fool's disability knowledge and ambiguous alliance with idiocy, and Edgar's simulation of disability as the mad beggar, Poor Tom. In what critics have called a social justice awakening, Lear in the storm suddenly recognizes the precarity of life on the margins. Poor naked wretches, wheresoe'er you are, that bide the pelting of this pitiless storm, how shall your houseless heads and unfed sides, your looped and windowed raggedness defend you from seasons such as these? Oh, I have ta'en too little care of this. Lear's care includes both the care of the state-sanctioned concern for vulnerable populations that he could and should have shown as sovereign, and the new relational care he's beginning to experience as part of a community of precarity. The wretches' looped raggedness denotes their hole-ridden clothing, loops as loopholes. It also connotes the stray threads of these tears, which extend as Lear loops himself in with these wretches, as Lear, Poor Tom, and the Fool become interknit on the heath, and as the scene loops in critics too. The visual renderings on these slides capture this movement from isolation to community in the calamity of the storm, the physical interdependence and looping among Lear, poor Tom, and the fool, their mutual recognition. Back to this for a second. So if depictions tending toward Baroque realism, like this print on the right, underline the swirled admixture of bodies, minds, and atmosphere, a stark modernist rendering like this one by Edward Gordon Craig, in which multiple human forms and prostheses become one creature, highlights the cooperation among the scene's forms of mental and intellectual disability, mental and physical suffering. In the scene, as Alice Equestri has delineated, madness and folly border into one another to signal the three men's equal condition as dispossessed outcasts whose social and geographical dislocation is reflected in their disability. The way dispossession leads to inclusion and recognition amongst the three is expressed when poor Tom inspires Lear's reflection on human dependence. Is man no more than this? Lear asks about Tom. Consider him well. Thou owest the worm no silk, the beast no hide, the sheep no wool, the cat no perfume. Ha! Here's three on us are sophisticated. Thou art the thing itself. Unaccommodated man is no more but such a poor, bare, forked animal as thou art. This moment is central to the play's disability discourse, even radical in its centering of the prostheses that support accommodated man. Lear's consideration of poor Tom, building on his care for poor naked wretches, makes interdependence, bodily vulnerability, and animal kinship central to what it means to be human. These dynamics of disability recognition expand into the critical discourse around Lear, which is animated by tension between the scene's ethics of community and care and the play's discomforting instrumentalization of disability. Instrumentalization perhaps distilled most distinctly in the deployment of blindness as a figure for insight. I stumbled when I saw, the blinded Gloucester says, but now I see feelingly. From these latter three words, uncoil the raveled loops of an invitation to feel with the play's representations of disability. Indeed, Lear's interlinked disability representations and recognitions have proved a potent focus of critical recognition and disavowal, a site of affect that propels a disability analysis. Christine Gottlieb opens her reading of Lear with a withering survey of its deployment of disability, suspicious of its metaphoricity. In many ways, King Lear's treatment of disability is embarrassing. The play relentlessly intertwines disability and tragedy, depicting the journeys of temporarily able-bodied bodies becoming disabled as central to its tragic arc. Disability is used as a narrative prosthesis in every one of King Lear's multiple plots. Gloucester is blinded, Lear experiences madness, Edgar feigns madness as poor Tom, and the fool is ambiguously aligned with intellectual disability. Additionally, disability is used as a problematic metaphor for characters' figurative sight, rationality, and decision-making. Lindsay Rauh-Haveld, in the opening paragraph of her disability studies exploration of Lear, diverges from Gottlieb's evaluation of the play's disability representations, yet shares its affective register. They both read Lear as saturated, almost overwhelmingly so, with disability meanings. King Lear is a play about disability. By this, I mean that King Lear is a play invested in understanding what disability is, showing how it operates, and expressing its lived experience. It does not only engage disability as an instrument for understanding other concerns or conditions. It does not treat disability exclusively as a metaphor. King Lear does not make disabled characters backdrops. It fills the stage with disabled bodies, mutilated bodies, marginalized bodies, unstable bodies, unwieldy bodies, bodies in pain, bodies at the edge of death. King Lear centers disability. Even as these two scholars differ in their assessment of the play's direct representation of disability, with Gottlieb identifying disability as misrecognition and Rauheveld through recognition, they converge in their orientation around the individual character as the magnet of disability analysis. For Gottlieb, Lear, Tom, and the Fool's experiences of disability, every one, each offers an example of narrative prosthesis, a crutch for the play's plot. For Rauheveld, Lear, Tom, and the Fool's multiple representations of disability create the play's rich domain of disability, yet they're importantly distinct. When Lear, the Fool, and Edgar all endure the storm, their various perspectives speak to the specificity of their disabled positions. Thus, as these two critics anchor in character, they acknowledge the presence of disability in Lear and value the forms of knowing expressed in these characters' embodied and minded experiences. Rauheveld's analysis loops in my third mode of recognition, identifying disability as one's own, as she connects the disability knowledge of Lear's characters to her own critical method, explicit in her conclusion. The embodied knowledge in King Lear has resounded with my own embodied knowledge of disability. My knowing in relation with the play has been affirming, revelatory, deeply disorienting, and even destructive, sometimes all at once. The complexity of recognition, the layer of resonance with the critic's own embodied knowledge in disability studies scholarship on Lear, is amplified in recent work by Pasquale Toscano. Toscano's preoccupation is disability's relation to the logics of tragic genre, and his work on Lear centers the fraught concept of pity. Pity is not anchored in a single character, but exists between characters in interstices and networks. And to loop pity into the dynamics of community and care already on the heath, perhaps pity is the feeling, care, the action. Toscano approaches the problematics of pity through his own embodied knowledge, entering the play through his experiences of navigating public space in, quote, my discomfiting physique, young and wobbly, cane-wielding but in its own fashion, somehow spry, caught between assumptions that he needs help and that he does not. Through these lived encounters, he is knit into the play's vexed economy of pity. The Aristotelian pity that is a process of identification leading to fellow feeling and fellow feeling to edifying engagement, the condescending pity of Goneril and Regan, the dangerously solipsistic pity of Cordelia, who finally acts not alongside Lear, but for him. While Toscano acknowledges the redemptive possibilities others have identified in the scenes in the storm, the insights that become possible through vulnerability, the scene's evocation of the possibility of ethical, mutual, reciprocal pity, he also experiments with skepticism about the scope of pity. He discerns Lear's volte-face, or turn away from the fool, who doesn't seem to want to be on the heath at all, toward Edgar's more persuasive performance as poor Tom. This volte-face, or turn, takes place in part because Lear imagines Tom as undergoing the same suffering as himself. Has his daughters brought him to this pass? But more devastatingly, Toscano suggests, because Edgar's disability simulation is catchier than the fool's adjacency to disability. The conditions that enable pity, engendering structures that would have seemed unimaginable at the start of the play, also delimit it. Pity, Toscano finally writes, is always ever the solution to a complicated equation with variables of merit and showmanship, relatability, and need. Once again, the fraying loop strays outward. The play exposes the insufficiency of pity in order to gesture toward the possibility, unrealized in the play's tragedy, of a more ethical mode of relation. Lear's disabled body minds intermingle the mental and physical, the real and the feigned, the acquired and the congenital, and emerge most powerfully in relationships among characters. The play blends disability experiences in encounters among characters whose shared cognitive atypicalities coincide with their shared bodily suffering. This interconnection moves them to recognition of interdependence, community, and mutual care. And this community transcends the play, a network of critics knit themselves into Lear's disability community, recognizing and participating in a powerful ethic of care in and for the play. If King Lear reveals the instability of disability recognition, its susceptibility to performance, selectivity, and what Toscano calls the catchiness of certain embodiments, then Richard III takes up that instability as a theatrical problem. I turn now to a second Shakespeare case study where I argue that disabled actors themselves bring unexpected recognitions to the role, new opportunities for recognizing Richard. Theorizing disability aesthetics in Shakespeare can mean identifying not only how plays deploy layers of disability figuration as an aesthetic strategy, but also how disability performance offers its own aesthetic affordances. What theatrical opportunities only become possible in the performance of disability by actors with disabilities? Richard III has been the iconic Shakespearean disabled character, even the iconic disabled character in English literature. As with any sought-after Shakespearean role, the history of playing Richard is defined by genealogies and crises of inheritance. Who played the role best? Who can and should play the role? How can the role be made new? Over the past 20 years, the discourse around Richard in performance has centered on disability representation in casting. A recent moment documents the cultural stakes of these debates. In January 2024, Shakespeare's Globe announced that their upcoming season would feature non-disabled Michelle Terry, the Globe's artistic director, as Richard III. There was pushback, most significantly from disabled artists. The Disabled Artists Alliance released an open letter objecting that the decision contravenes the Globe's ethos of diversity and inclusion, and that the play cannot be successfully performed with a non-physically disabled actor at the helm. Terry replied, as rebuttal and justification, that she would not alter her physicality to explore the role. She would not play disabled, and that this production of Richard III would not represent a permanent revision of the play or the eternal erasure of the character's impairment. In denying the permanence of the Globe production and the power of her embodied representation to revise and erase, Terry evokes the history and future of the role of Richard III. Richard, like all major theatrical roles, is haunted by all the actors who have played the part before. In Figure of Disability, I trace genealogy through bibliographical debates about the many early texts of Richard III, texts whose curvilinear relationships index the motile spine of their eponymous character. Yet Richard himself, inside his story, denies genealogy. In King Henry VI, Part 3, the Shakespearean prequel to Richard III, Richard articulates his solitary power. I had no father. I am like no father. I have no brother. I am like no brothers. I am myself alone. Appealing to his anomalous physicality, Richard denies genealogical connections. These same lines link his difference to his extraordinary ambition. Accordingly, Richard's powerful atypicality has made the role a site for theatrical aspiration. I take Richard's refusal of genealogy seriously and decline a straight chronological stage history of Richard III that would run from the non-disabled Richards who claimed the role for 400 plus years toward disabled actors who would then be positioned as belated inheritors. Instead, I treat the disability performance tradition with primacy. Richard out of time, out of line, out of spine. While Richard in King Henry VI, Part 3, describes a mountain on his back as part of his atypical embodiment, Richard's description of his physical difference in his opening soliloquy in Richard III eliminates this specificity, suggesting vaguely that he is not shaped for sportive tricks, deformed, unfinished, half made up. When the historical Richard's skeleton was discovered under a parking lot in Leicester, England in 2012, it did little to fix a shared understanding of the truth of Richard's embodiment. Writing about the epistemological crisis of this discovery in Figure of Disability, I noticed how the desire for the truth of Richard's body animates his spine, inviting us to view it from different angles. Maybe Richard's spine has a very pronounced curve, or is even weirdly curved in a ghastly S. Or maybe he only had a slight deformity that would have barely affected his appearance. Across texts and osteological discoveries, Richard's body remains a body in motion, inviting us on a journey through different angles on his atypicality. I want us to see that this body on stage is theatrically kinetic, both within and across performances by disabled actors, of which there have been many over the past 2 decades. These performances honor the ethical imperative that disabled artists be cast, including, but not only, in disabled roles. Scholars of disability performance have introduced significant nuance to the politics of disability representation in theater, proposing, for example, to rethink the assumption that the authenticity disabled actors bring to the portrayal of disabled characters is always a positive move, or noticing how obviously non-disabled actors portraying disablement may instruct audiences in the social model of disability as audiences discover that they are creating the spectacle themselves. In turning to disability performance of Richard III, I want to focus on what disabled actors recognize in Richard, how their performances uncover and express new meanings for the character in the play, manifesting disability aesthetics and disability knowledge, especially insights into relationships among bodies and prostheses. Performances of Richard III by actors with disabilities stage disability in the making, putting the character in motion outside the bounds of his singularity. Consider that when non-disabled actors perform Richard III may reduce to the circumference of the question, how will the non-disabled actor simulate disability? Michael Patrick Thornton, the actor and wheelchair user who performed Richard at Steppenwolf in Chicago in 2016, articulates how non-disabled actors bring a limiting focus to that question. I read Anthony Scher's Year of the King about his preparation and process for Richard III, which he performed at the Royal Shakespeare Company in 1984. Pages and pages dedicated to his sketches of how to play Richard as a bottled spider, and his use of arm crutches and physical training. I look at that focus on one aspect, the disability, by a non-disabled actor, and it seems sadly empty and sort of parlor tricky. As the theater historian Paul Menzer writes of Scher's canonical prosthetic Richard, he looks like an actor with a couple of props. The crutches are just props. They are there to remind you that he does not need them. The stage hump, the superfluous leg brace, their purpose is complete once they've been added to the actor's body. Disability is accomplished before the play begins. In Shakespeare and Disability Theory, I explore how 2 recent productions of Richard III offer examples of how disabled actors create a prosthetic process that unfolds dynamically across the play. At Chicago Shakes in 2024, Katie Sullivan, a bilateral transfemoral amputee and Paralympian, brought vibrant athleticism to Richard. Sullivan's Richard began the play sitting on the ground, moving about the stage with quick agility before transitioning to a wheelchair that is pushed, then a wheelchair she spins herself, to prosthetic legs which become more ornate as Richard moves up. Finally, for the play's finale, Sullivan's Richard puts on Paralympic running blades on which he jumps up and down. This Richard's unfinishedness is a continuous experiment in finishing, and prosthetic making up is a process that unfurls during the play. Prosthetic use and movement is a skill. Sullivan swaps prosthetic legs as quickly as most of us change channels on the remote. The movement amongst prostheses, shifts in physicality, allow director Edward Hall and Sullivan to tell the story of Richard's ferocious ambition through new stage pictures. She is able to explore the specific stage images that she, a double amputee, can create with her body. The mental changeability that Hall has always seen in the character now has a physical correlative in Sullivan. Echoing Thornton's critique of Scher's book, Sullivan relates, "There were so many accounts that I read of actors who'd played this role, and so much of their thought process was the disability. They became obsessed with that being the thing. As Sullivan suggests, even as prostheses may visually extend the body of the non-disabled actor, they reduce it ontologically. They are performing lessness, limitation, which resonates ironically rather than directly with Richard's pursuit of the crown." I also analyze how Thornton's 2016 performance as Richard anticipated Sullivan's in its deployment of a sequence of prostheses that captured Richard's protean qualities in a disability lexicon. Thornton shifted from wheelchair to walker to the rewalk, a state-of-the-art exoskeleton. This last prosthesis deployed in tandem with physicians and therapists from the Rehabilitation Institute of Chicago. As director Jessica Thebus puts it, Richard projects an extension of his body that he uses at different times for different purposes. Press coverage celebrated that Thornton was the first disabled actor to do a stage performance with an exoskeleton, and the reveal of the rewalk was designed as a theatrical feat. Thornton delivered a stunning coup de théâtre just before intermission when he, as Richard, rose out of his wheelchair and walked again, courtesy of the rewalk. Perhaps in tension with the supercrypt fantasies implied in the celebration of this collaboration with the RIC, Thornton and Thebus understood the rewalk as a step toward limitation, not further freedom. They treated the exoskeleton as an extension of the crown, the thing Richard thinks will make him feel finished and complete, when in fact, Thornton's Richard is freer and more powerful without it, and neither the English throne nor a normal body will assuage his ambition and bitter self-loathing. The rewalk is not the apotheosis of prosthesis, though audience members might presume this is the case, but rather a phantasm of achievement. As Richard thinks he will be complete once he has the crown, the production invites audiences to think they will know Richard when they know his disability inside and out. Yet the notion that disability may be both externalized and laid bare for full visual comprehension is as deceptive as the allure of the crown, as the end of the tragedy shows. What I want us to perceive is that disability performance remakes the Shakespeare play's ontology, conducting Richard on a live, transformative, mutable journey. These performances confound a characteristic trap, a loop of original and copy, in which non-disabled Richard III's are ensnared. The incisive freshness that disability performance, disability knowledge, bring to the play is all the clearer in contrast to the crisis that non-disabled Richard III performances create for themselves. Non-disabled actors conflate the burden of creating a new interpretation of the role itself with the self-imposed burden of physical risk, the disabling effects of disability simulation. Recall Anthony Scher's theatrical memoir of his 1984 performance as Richard, Year of the King. The text whose fixation on how to perform disability Thornton assessed as sadly empty and sort of parlor tricky. Scher's preparation for the role is ghosted by the fear of impersonating other disability impersonations. A grisly exhibition in the fitting room. This is Ian Holmes' foot. This Ian Richardson's, and here's Alan Howard's. Shadows of previous Richards haunt Scher. Olivier's, again that giant shadow falls across the landscape, enfolding him in the shadow of chosen physical risk shared by non-disabled Richards. Richard is notorious for crippling actors. They spend years afterwards on osteopaths' couches. That's what an osteopath is, since not all Americans use this word. This journey to the osteopath begins with the climbing and bearing of Richard, this Everest, no, this Matterhorn of a part. The figure of the mountain becomes central to Scher's conception of the role, made literal as he prepares under the shadow of the peak Lion's Head in his hometown of Cape Town. Lion's Head provides a site to process ideas about Richard's embodiment and metaphorizes what Scher sees as the looming task of the performance. The mountain has tremendous power. Richard III is in there somewhere. It looks like a Richard shape viewed slightly from behind. The mountain is a terrifying silhouette against midnight. It's this fucking mountain I keep circling. The power of this flexible metaphor, Richard as mountain, Richard in mountain, mountain in on Richard, is striking to me. As a literary critic, I love metaphors and their operations. So imagine my delight to find an alternate metaphor for the role of Richard in a conversation between two disabled artists. For disabled actors, the role is not a mountain. Speaking to the performer and disability activist Greg Mosgala, Thornton tropes disability performance of Richard like this. I do think it matters that you and I, artists with disabilities, are currently playing the looming Macy's Thanksgiving parade balloon character of all disabled characters. An extravagant metaphor. What does it mean to recognize Richard as a massive parade balloon? This figure apprehends many of the forms of disability I discuss in Shakespeare and Disability Theory, forms that take shape around mutable energies and are never static. Experienced from perspectives below on the street or theatrically from a window or on a screen, this balloon form is conjured by the simultaneous contemporaneity, nostalgia, and trouble of Macy's and Thanksgiving, and animated by the energy of the urban scene in which the parade takes place. So I'll end by floating the Richard balloon as a figure we know, blown up to tremendous size, as imagined, created, controlled, and directed by both national and local communities. It creates community in its witnessing. The balloon's skin continually reshapes itself around the form it serves. As a kind of prosthesis that molds the embodied air inside, the balloon is made and unmade before our eyes. In recognizing this form of Richard, I suggest we recognize early modern theatrical disability moving towards and away from us on a route both spatial and temporal, alongside the built world without, propelled by dynamic forces within. Thanks.